We are so excited to host this launch event this evening for Black Britain and Nelson Mandela, edited by Elizabeth Williams and published by Bloomsbury earlier this year. We have a wonderful panel of distinguished speakers, all contributors to the book, to discuss the book's themes and insights this evening. My name's Claire George, and I'm one of the archivists at SOAS Library. And one of our richest areas of collections, the papers of anti-apartheid activists who were exiled from South Africa, came to the UK and led and inspired the anti-apartheid movement. The Institute of Commonwealth Studies, whose collection Senate House Library now holds, was particularly active in collecting records on Southern Africa and South African apartheid. And you'll have hopefully seen the images from those incredible archives projected on the screen. One of our more recent donations was the archive of Adelaide and Joseph, whose daughter Nadia is, of course, one of the contributors to the book, and she's on our panel of speakers today. I also wanted to mention another area of our collections which connects with the theme this evening, our Caribbean archives and special collections, as they're the focus of our current exhibition, In the Grip of Change, the Caribbean and British Diaspora, which traces British Caribbean colonies' paths to independence and highlights the work of transnational activists. And that exhibition is on the fourth floor, running until the 12th of April. It's free to enter, so please do come and see it. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping points. First, we're not expecting any fire alarms to go off, but if one does, please follow the nearest fire exit signs and head back down to the ground floor via the stairs and assemble in front of Senate House, either in Russell Square or at Street as directed. For the toilets, if you go out, turn left, go through two sets of double doors, past the stairwell, you'll see a door on your right. And finally, we have a copy of the book here this evening, and we have a stall at the back with some information about how you can do a copy. And there is a reduction at the moment to order online. So we'd also like to invite you to join us for a drink after the event, so you'll have plenty of time to order copies then. So I'd like now to introduce you to our panel of speakers. Christopher Roy Zembe is a lecturer in history at Montfort University and co-editor of the journal Black History's Dialogues, published by Taylor and Francis Online. His research interests are the African diaspora and colonial and post-colonial histories of sub-Saharan Africa. Gregory Alake is an advocate of critical legal thinking with over 30 years public experience in health services, local authority and higher education. And his academic interests focuses on South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Nadia Joseph has been involved in South African politics personally and professionally. The daughter of veterans of the liberation struggle, she herself worked for the anti-apartheid movement in London and remains an active campaigner around the issues of social justice. Sireita Mullings is a visual sociologist and artist and community arts practitioner whose work draws on post-colonial studies, race and representation. And she uses participatory and visual research methods pivoted on themes of digital creativity, youth, class, gender, social enterprise, social exclusion, inclusion, belonging, migration, education, safety, and danger. And then finally, our moderator this evening, Professor Gus John, who's a Grenadian-born writer, education campaigner, consultant, lecturer, and researcher who moved to the UK in 1964. He's worked in the fields of education policy, management, and international development. And as a social analyst, he specialises in social audits, change management, policy formulation and review, and programme evaluation and development. So I'm now going to hand over to Gus.
Well, colleagues, good evening, and thank you all for joining us, those who are here and those who are online. Before I invite, so there are 11 contributors to this volume, including Dr. Elizabeth Williams, who edited the stuff. We are joined by the four whom Claire just told you about. But before I ask them to join me here, I just want to say what connects me with this conversation and with the contents of this book. So as Claire said, I came to this country in 1964 from Grenada for the sole purpose of doing theology and becoming a Roman Catholic priest. Now, many don't believe this, but it is actually true. I joined the Dominican order, the order of preachers, and discovered in the course of my theological studies that the Dominicans had two colleges in South Africa, one in Wits and the other in Stellenbosch. And it was the practice of the Dean of Studies in both places to come to Oxford, to Blackfriars, the theological college there, and choose from among those who are going to be ordained, who will come to South Africa to be parish priests or university chaplains or whatever. And the first year the dean came, we met, had a sumptuous meal and met in the senior common room and much pomp and ceremony. And then we sat down to have a discussion. He got onto the business of who amongst us were going to go to South Africa to do these things. And there was no discussion whatsoever about the apartheid regime. The second year, that same dean came back. I was in a cohort of 19, the only Black friar at Blackfriars. And we had a similar conversation. So I was bold enough by then to ask, where are Black people in South Africa trained as Dominican priests? And they told me about the college at Witwatersrand and Stellenbosch. I said, well, if I were to be there, where would I be? And then they described the separation, the separated arrangements that there are for people from South Africa itself and other Africans from elsewhere on the continent. And we got into a theological argument that I think this man found most uncomfortable. And I simply asked one very simple question. I mean, legitimate for a theologian to ask, I think. And my question was, if Jesus were here, what would he do? And the whole place degenerated, the thing degenerated into a kind of shouting match and whatever. And that, in fact, that night and that conversation really did it for me and was the reason why I'm standing here in front of you now, not in the cloth, but as I am. I determined not to continue to be a Roman Catholic priest. Because not only was the church complicit in apartheid in South Africa, it was also giving divine absolution to tyrants all over the place, Franco, Salazar, and all those Latin American countries that were being run by dictators. That's one anecdote. The other that connects me with this is this. When I left Blackfriars, I became a member of an organization called the British Council of Churches. It's now called Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. But then, as the BCC, we had regular contacts with the World Council of Churches. And I became a member of the World Council of Churches program to combat racism. And that program, the PCR, was working with liberation struggles and liberation programs around the world, including in South Africa. And to their utter discredit, the churches in this country, particularly the Church of England, determined that they would stop giving money. They had a subvention that enabled the World Council of Churches to do its work. They would stop funding the work of the World Council of Churches because it was supporting terrorists. And amongst those terrorists, of course, in their book was the ANC. And even before Margaret Thatcher dubbed Nelson Mandela a terrorist, this church organization had done the same. Roll on a number of years, 20 plus years, Nelson Mandela gets released. He comes to this country, and those hypocritical so-and-sos flocked to welcome him and treat him as if he were St. Nelson, forgetting that they fought with us in the World Council of Churches program to combat racism when we were trying to support the armed struggle and support the ANC and get apartheid dismantled and Nelson Mandela released. The third anecdote is this, and it brings it pretty much closer to home. With John LaRose and members of the Black Parents Movement in North London, John LaRose was a publisher. He published New Beacon books. We had a program whereby every Saturday we gathered outside Tesco's in Stroud Green Road and picketed and protested and spoke and told people why they should not buy South African goods. We spoke against the British government, why that was consistently breaking sanctions and doing their own deals with the apartheid regime. So this book connects with all of that, as well as with the debates we had within our own movement here, and indeed other groups around the country, when Desmond Tutu chaired that Truth and Reconciliation Committee and was trying to bully Winnie Mandela into admitting that she had committed a murder. It's an important publication, a very important publication, because it links our efforts here as Black people living with racism in Britain, systemic state racism in Britain, with the struggles of Black people around the world. We supported liberation movements and liberation struggles in Southern Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau. I had the honor in 1972, some couple of months before he passed on, of hosting Amilcar Cabral in Manchester after a rally we had there in the Free Trade Hall. And Cabral and myself and other activists sat through the night talking about the struggles to liberate Guinea-Bissau and the Cape Verde Islands. And it shook us all to the core when 6 weeks after the man left here, he was assassinated. So that's what connects me with this project. And that's why I'm standing here moderating in lieu of Elizabeth Williams, who can't be with us. Could I then ask my colleagues, Greg, Chris, Sireita, Nadia, to join me on the podium, please? So what we will do is we'll have a conversation. They tell you something about themselves and about their involvement in the project. I'd ask them some not too searching questions. And then we would invite your questions. Thank you. So my friends, welcome and thank you for your contribution to the book. It was fascinating for me to see the various angles from which you contributed, and the connection you make between the liberation struggles against apartheid and the struggles against British racism in this society. So I want to ask you first, each of you, to give me some indication as to what made you sign on to this project, and what did you want people to get out of your contributions? Chris.
Thank you, Gus. Well, for me, it was the comments or the narrative which was constructed after the death of Mandela in 2013, comparing him with Mugabe. I'm from Zimbabwe, so I'm one of those who were under Robert Mugabe. This comparison which took place, it exposed the hypocrisy of the Western countries when it comes to constructing a narrative of a nationalist. Because as we all know, in the 80s, Mugabe was the darling of the West. Then all of a sudden, he became the worst person ever. And I said to myself, when we are looking at legacy, which narrative are we supposed to listen to or to construct? Hence, a chapter, the question of legacy. Mandela is not Mugabe, because these are two individuals, non-nationalist. Their journey, yes, it has been well documented, but there are differences we need to look at. And my chapter looks at those. So hopefully I'll get time to look at the key issues, the issue of the Cold War, the issue of negotiations for independence, the issue of can be the issue of to do with SADC. All these and how they addressed the issues after independence, all these are important when it comes to the issue of constructing a narrative of legacy. So Mugabe is not Mandela. They are both good, but to compare the two, I believe at times let's have a conversation about it.
I'd want to ask you later about the land reform program of Mugabe and what's going on in South Africa right now, and our dear friend Donald Trump, but that's for later. Sireita, do you want?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for facilitating, hosting the panel, and it's great to be amongst people and with such amazing minds who have really assisted in my understanding, um, of, or more understanding of Mandela. I'm struggling with where to start, and I think it probably makes sense with the quote that really pulled me in, and it was, "A fundamental concern for others in our individual and community lives would go a long way in making the world the better place we so passionately dream of." I'll start there and then I'll move on to my practice as a community arts practitioner working in South London, Brixton, for a number of years. I'll stick a pin there and I'll go further back to being probably around 11 in the living room with my mom and my brother in our Brixton home. So shortly after the uprisings, and I remember mommy said, I'd never seen so many Black people in one place, never. And then she said to me, well, you wait till you go to Jamaica and you'll see. And I said, oh, okay, but why did he go? What was the problem? You know, trying to make sense of what had happened at such a young age. I never saw my mother as political, but I then came to understand by default, our very bodies are political in this space. And when she had said, you will see, having gone to Jamaica, and I was educated at the Edna Manley College of Visual and Performing Arts and the University of the West Indies, things started to make sense. I returned to the UK and began working with the Lambeth Youth Offending Team, facilitating creative programs. And that was when I realized these problems are structural, they're systemic, and they are also very tiring. But how do you get to the root of some of the issues that I was making sense of whilst delivering these creative programs? So I'm going to move forward again to the work in the Gambia. Whilst making sense of what was happening with young people on the ground here in the UK, in my community, Brixton, I decided I needed to look elsewhere and see what's happening with young people elsewhere. And whilst there, I simply went to engage with a group of young men who were interested in preserving their history. They wanted to archive their narrative, and I wanted to make sense of what did they mean by that? What does it mean to archive African history? This is the Gambia. Surely we cannot speak about the entire content through certain pieces of work. The point is, the most significant conversations emerged through that practice, through that engagement with the visual. And one of them was this whisper of the back way. So every other family I came to learn was very much afraid of their child traveling clandestinely to Europe. And if many of you probably already know, we see it as a migrant crisis. The narrative that was missing is the level of planning that goes into that migration. I was blown by it. The mere fact that a young person will be saving, selling mobile phones for at least 3 years to save money to pay rebels and hostages when he gets to Libya was a complete distraction from my art program. And it was one that made me realize that in the UK, we have at the time when I was doing the work I was doing, it was about gang violence. And here we have the back way. What is it? What's really going on? What is it that is happening with these young people that makes them feel as though if they leave, life will be better? Of course, we can't ignore the economic situation and so forth. But again, all of that is structural. All of that is very much based upon systemic racism. What really brought me to the project, or what made me agree to the invitation. Liz amazingly, was so patient in my feeling as though I didn't know enough about Mandela to contribute, was the mere fact that education and leadership was something that I knew he always spoke about. And it was something that I felt was taking place within the young men I worked with on this program. So they were inherently activists because they decided they're not leaving the Gambia. They are staying and they are going to produce art during tourist season and farm during the off season. And I can go on, but that is what pulled me to this project. So it's really the making sense of Mandela's legacy and how that helps us pull apart and unpack some of the structural problems that are playing out in young people's contemporary lives today across the continent and within England. So we're talking about Africans in the diaspora, Caribbean people in the diaspora, and of course, we're all very much connected. The narrative is not linear. And so through this project and through the Visual Voices program, I was really able to start to unpack some of these bigger issues.
Thank you, everybody. It's been great. I got involved mainly on two folds. I don't know if anyone has heard about Orania, which is a white-only town in South Africa. I saw the video and I thought, how could this be? I thought the transition has already taken place. How could that be? And that led me to the economic appetite that was happening in South Africa. So I got interested, digging deep into the information, and having done a lot of research in law, I've got to like Mandela, his jurisprudence, and it got me thinking about the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I thought, hang about, there's all this talk of peace and what's happened? What change has happened for the Black people in South Africa? They've gone through a lot. They fought the battle. How come things went different? And then you look at something like a Nuremberg style, so which is like a winner takes all. And if you win a battle, you control the battle. So you can dictate what you want. And that led me to start digging deeper to look at the question I posed in my chapter, would, instead of the TRC, would a different approach have delivered a different outcome for South Africa? And it was really interesting to go through the research to find out about what's happened if Mandela and Desmond Tutu haven't agreed to TRC, what would have happened? It could actually have been worse. So I wanted the readers to find out themselves and make that decision as to what would have happened. Because when you go through the chapter, you will find out that the generals and the National Party wouldn't have agreed to TRC, for example, if amnesty wasn't going to be given to the generals. And you'll find out in that chapter that it is one of those important projects, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For example, recently we saw how Trump humiliated the president of Ukraine. And it was based on the fact that he hasn't got the information, no truth was there. So truth is very, very important when you try to manage a conflict. So if Trump had known, I mean, people will remember him saying were the attackers, but everybody knows they were not. So truth and reconciliation, very important when you try to manage a conflict. So it was things like this that got me interested, and I'm so glad I got involved in that because it opens my eyes, and hopefully it will open the eyes of the readers. Thank you.
Thank you. Nadia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming, those who I know and the others. The background for me getting involved with this project was connected with my first kind of proper meeting with Elizabeth. I'd taken my son to an event at the Institute of Education for an anniversary of the Soweto uprising, and Elizabeth spoke at that. And then there was an event at sort of towards the end of 2018, actually at Birkbeck, and it actually requires a whole story in itself, but I'll give you the gist of it. There was a screening of 2 films about Winnie Mandela, one that was very negative about her and another one that was very positive. And it was a very bizarre session, is all I can say. It felt very set up, and there were several academics there on the panel. Elizabeth was one of only 2 Black contributors on the panel, and it became very heated. It felt like it was a real setup. Anyhow, the audience got involved in this conversation. One of the people that was actually chairing it, I won't name him now, was very condescending towards a young Black female student. So it was, it was an interesting event for probably all the wrong reasons. And at the end of that, I actually contributed. I waited to hear what other people had to say. And then I said what I felt was important to kind of give it some context and also to kind of question the whole atmosphere in the room. And Elizabeth spoke to me afterwards and said, oh, it's really interesting. And we spoke about what she'd said, etc. And then she said she's planning this book. That's how long ago she started planning the book. And would I be interested in contributing to it? And I said, well, I'm not an academic. I don't teach, and it would be quite difficult for me to write with any kind of critical distance because, I'm the daughter of South African freedom fighters, and I've been kind of born into the struggle here. And so, yes, I'd love to write something. I've done some journalism and a bit of writing, but not a huge amount. And I felt that it would be quite hard to be part of something that was essentially an academic work. And then she said, well, you've been an activist, so do it from that point of view, and it will bring a different kind of perspective. And so that's what I did. And I think some of you would have seen the slides when you were walking in about my parents' participation in the struggle and the fact that they were good friends with Nelson and Winnie, amongst many other comrades. And so it's really from that perspective as one of the daughters of Paul and Adelaide, and my work here, both for the anti-apartheid movement and then later when I joined the ANC, kind of looking at that, the gulf between Mandela being the leader of an organization that had evolved from being a fairly conservative organization before he joined to one that then became revolutionary post Sharpeville, and my father's involvement with that. And then looking at then, as Gus was mentioning earlier, how he had gone from a terrorist to a saint. And really my chapter's kind of trying to interrogate that narrative and how it's basically one that took him as the kind of maker of his history out of control and was kind of hijacked, I feel, by a lot of people. So that's kind of where my chapter sits within this book.
Thank you so much, all of you. So, Chris, it's really important and interesting what you shared about the comparison between Robert Mugabe and Mandela. There's been an enormous amount of concern on the continent and indeed amongst Black people in the diaspora about what is actually happening in South Africa just now. The xenophobia, the treatment of Africans from neighboring countries, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, whatever. And now the issue of land reform, the sincerity, if you like, with which Cyril Ramaphosa is approaching that stuff in relation to his own involvement with Lonmin and Marikana and all of that stuff. How do you see the lessons, if you like, from Mugabe and land reform in Zimbabwe being understood and applied in the situation that South Africa is in just now?
That's a very, okay, there are two questions. I'll start with the second one, the issue of land, which I'll tie in with the problems settler colonies had in trying to address the problems of colonialism. In Africa, you find that the settler colonies where there were so many whites compared to others, where South Africa, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, there were very few in Kenya. Those nations had massive problems on how to address the issues. And now going back to what is happening in South Africa now, Ramaphosa, of course, is getting pressure from Blacks. I believe there's genuineness to address the issues, but the problem, like what was for Mugabe, the Western world, would they agree to that? How aggressive are you supposed to be to address what happened during colonial rule? That's where the problem rises. That's where Mugabe became this despot. Okay, of course, we can have a conversation with Mugabe. The other issues where he messed up here, we agree. But when you tried to be so much assertive when it comes to addressing in a radical way, after he had been messed up by this willing buyer, willing seller, the Lancaster House Constitution had so many irregularities, had so many issues which were not solved at that conference. And when Mugabe decided to do it, the Western world was up in arms. And now we are going to Ramaphosa, South Africa. They are saying we want to take we want to redistribute land within our laws. But hang on a minute. America saying no. So, but why? So it all boils down to the issue of to be recognized, regrettably, in the 21st century, just like what it was in the 20th century, as a good nationalist, you're supposed to sort of maintain the status quo to some extent, which is wrong. And that has resulted in some of the nationalists being branded as being not reasonable, whether it's Zuma, whether it's even Mbeki, because Mbeki was beginning to make noises of the need to address the problems in South Africa. He was being branded as not so good. Okay, that's one issue. Can carry on after this discussion. Then your first question on xenophobic attacks in South Africa. That said, especially this is black on black. And this is something which I'm trying to grapple with, but I'll just tell you my theory. I believe there are some Africans in South Africa, said to say, who were affected by apartheid so much that they cannot appreciate seeing another Black person succeeding. Because apartheid, for some, it had put them in a corner. Might be wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected. It had put them in a corner that this is your place as a Black person. And when another Black person comes from Nigeria, from Zambia, and they see that person doing very well, I believe there are some who are trying to adjust that concept that no, a Black person can do well. So for me, as Chris, my theory, as I said, which can be critiqued, I don't mind, is this can be an impact of apartheid on some within the Black community that they are not appreciating a fellow African. That when you see a fellow African doing well in South Africa, they would accept it, which is so sad. And it's something I think we need to talk more about, that why this violence, blacks on blacks, happening in South Africa.
Thank you. Greg, I want to relate this, Chris's answer to what you were saying about the TRC. In this sense, it's easy to imagine, and you don't have to imagine it, there's evidence for it, that the oppressed Black population of South Africa, who endured massacres and dehumanization and God knows what for so long, came out of that whole process with a settlement that Nelson Mandela made with that whole regime, feeling that there had been no reparation, there'd been no recompense, there'd been no acceptance of responsibility on the part of those who had oppressed them for so long and murdered God knows how many people. And to that extent, the mindset of people, which is about being let down, being dispossessed, continuing to see, if you like, structural oppression going on amongst them, relates very much to their attitudes towards others, even if they know that people are coming there with very good intentions and for very good economic reasons. So how do you square that business about non-reparations and the repetition, in fact, of much that was going on during the apartheid regime, with people's attitudes towards one another, in terms of serious violence towards their neighbors, etc.?
Yeah, you're quite right. And also going back to what Chris said, there wasn't any motivation, or instead of them seeing Black on Black, a Black man that is doing well as a kind of a motivation, they're not seeing it as that. They are going back to the subconscious kind of hate that's been built in their mind. So that's one. And going back to the reparation, if you look at the numbers of people that applied and the numbers of people that got given, you can see why some of the Black people felt they've been let down by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. When people like us look at it, thinking it's the good model, especially when you look at countries that have come from dictators and tyrant leaders, like in Chile or in Argentina, they are wanting to transition into democratic society. And people are looking at TRC as a good model. However, when you look at the people that actually gone through the TRC process, It is probably the way it was managed rather than the principle of it. The principle is brilliant. It's good in a way of settling conflicts, what have you, or problem of the past. It's a good way of settling that. However, if you don't get the process right, it means you can have some problems later, like we saw with South Africa.
Sireita, I found your sojourn in Gambia very interesting, especially the way in which the young people that were organizing themselves and making decisions about their role in nation building. How would you relate that to what we know to be going on in this country, particularly given the systemic racism that there is, and the way in which young people are treated by the state and its institutions?
Well, one of the things that really struck me was the way in which the young people, the young people that I worked with, the young men and few young women. It was predominantly young men, but there were at least 3 women amongst them who were very clear on not wanting to be a part of that problem, not wanting to look to the West for salvation. And that is one of the things that really pulled me, you know, that turned my interest to how young people are mobilizing themselves, how they've identified what is required to survive in terms of farming, recognizing that they need to sustain themselves. And that was one of the drives to merge or to create at the time. The organization that they registered was actually called Art Farm. That was a couple of years ago. Earth Farm continues. And I know you're asking about the sort of awareness of systemic racism. And that was what became visible to me, that even though some of them had never left, there was one young man who was here on a program in Birmingham and returned and decided that this is not a place and wanted to educate the others, wanted to let the others know that, look, it's not what you think, despite, and I think there's a little section in the chapter that says, despite how you see people posing up on pretty cars and nice buildings, life isn't like that over there. And I felt like I needed to support them in advocating that mission amongst the rest of the young people in the Gambia, especially having experienced one of the young men who was my host and security guard, and he was teaching me, you know, how to speak Mandinka. Of course, for me, growing up in Britain, Mandinka is almost like an authentic African language. Like, of course, I want to speak Mandinka, you know. So there's this British Jamaican girl learning Mandinka with this young man in the morning who would walk me to the internet cafe, and then returning to the UK to learn that he had died trying to travel. He drowned trying to travel back way. That compelled me even more to want to work with these young men in understanding what it means to do art farming, what it means to grow moringa. And one of the beautiful things is they were going into primary schools and having the children understand the power of the moringa seed, having children understand that you can actually grow the seed and draw it bit by bit. So you get the art farm connection. And I just felt that that was the beginning of something really fruitful. So hope that answers.
Nadia, one question for you. You mentioned the Soweto uprisings. And again, making comparisons between South Africa and Britain, and particularly the consciousness of young people, one gets the sense that there's a much higher degree of political literacy amongst young people in South Africa than in this country, generally speaking, and in relation to the Black diaspora here particularly. Do you think that schools or this whole education system in this place can assist young people in understanding more what their position is within the social structure, as Black people particularly, who have had this designation of being underachievers and causing problems in schools and all of that kind of stuff? If they were to seriously consider what caused those young people to revolt before they were massacred in Soweto, and how that consciousness of their rights, their education rights, could be developed amongst young people here.
Yeah, it's working. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question about how and why people do become politicized or why they don't. And I think, you know, in 1976, well, really from the mid-60s through to the mid-70s in South Africa, it was the nation really in many ways politically was orphaned. And I think that had a huge impact on the young people. So most of the activists from the 60s were either in jail, had been murdered, or a number had gone into exile. And I think life in the townships under this extreme brutality, it was, there was nothing to lose by going out and actually protesting. Everything in every aspect of life was so brutal and unequal. And it was something that people weren't being, they didn't even have television. Television was banned in South Africa until 1976. So those kinds of distractions and the kind of advertising that happens here and the kind of, when people are seeing things online and the kind of consumer society, Black people in South Africa didn't have that at all. And here I feel, it's a very complex issue, and it's something that I've discussed a lot with my family and with friends who are here tonight, about the kind of divisions that were created here as well. So that there are those of us here that were collaborating amongst the different groups, but in a way, South Africa's stratification was so sophisticated. Here, it was a different experience, and I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that where we are now in this lack of engagement, I think has its history in a number of things, and I think some of it is because we had Black people coming from parts of continental Africa and the Caribbean who had been part of the Commonwealth, and that generation before weren't necessarily politicized in the same way, and had a kind of maybe an unacknowledged allegiance to the Commonwealth and the Crown, and we know about the kind of focus on the Windrush generation, but prior to that and subsequently, I think they felt, well, we have, they assumed that they had a right to be here, and they should have felt they had that right, but they discovered otherwise. And then I think the kind of economic issues that were going on here, just for white British people, there was this great positivism after the war, and wonderful things were put in place, education and council housing and the NHS. And by the 60s and 70s, we saw the rise of the National Front. We saw the kind of rise in unemployment. And when people came from Indians from Uganda and Kenya, many of them treated very badly there, but often came with their own prejudices from their home countries of India and parts of India. It became a very divided world here. And I think, unfortunately, I think that's continued. And whilst those amongst us who have worked together and forged connections across those kind of really quite deliberate barriers, I feel, have understood what being Black is as a political term. I think a lot of our youth feel very disconnected from that history. And whilst they might know about Nelson Mandela or Steve Biko or Malcolm X and then be inspired by him, I think in their everyday lives, my experience of working with young people, and I'm not by any means saying I'm an expert, is one of total disaffection. And I think they're often because they live in a world that appears to be very wealthy, and they feel that they've got an equal stake in it, and yet they know their everyday experience is one of racism and subjugation. But there's this kind of artificiality going on that distracts people from actually bringing them together and uniting on common goals. And I know that in my work for Anti-Apartheid Legacy, one of the things we do when we work with school children is one of the things that I always mention is that we can't succumb to those sorts of divisions. We have to recognize what the problems are. Just as you were talking about the problems in terms of the kind of prejudice towards people from other parts of Africa, the class struggle is the class struggle, and that is still in place. And here, I think it's very divisive the way people are treated. There is lots to keep people feeling separate from other groups and not making those connections, and looking for those commonalities in terms of oppression. And I think a lot of the young people that I've worked with and I've met, their parents perhaps haven't been engaged in activism. And so they have that model seems quite far away. They think of these heroes of people from the past. And then when they think about the more recent ones, from other countries like the Steve Bikos, which again is a long time ago now in their lives, they think, well, what happened to them? And then there are still deaths in custody, and we know the kind of treatment that young people have every day. I think it's created a sort of a kind of a dystopian feel towards life, I think, a lot of the time. And I think we need to do a lot of work and really model the fact that actually when the stakes are that high, you have to kind of build those bridges. That's the reality, because you can only work together and be conscious of those divisions, I think. There's a lot of work to do, is what I'm saying.
Thank you so much. And thank you all. I'll bring you in after we get some questions from the floor. It's over to you now. We've got about half an hour. If you could indicate by raising a hand so that I can see you. Yes, my brother.
Good evening, panel. My name is Adekunle Tijani. I'm sure you can tell by that name that that's a Nigerian name. I'm a solicitor advocate by profession. Mr. Alake is sitting down in front. Is my childhood friend. We grew up together. I recall that you're referring to him as Greg. I know him as Abayomi Alake. And the reason why I started my story with that is this. Your identity is part of your culture. Your name is part of your culture. I've been in situations whereby my name has been wrongly pronounced in the courtroom, and I refuse to stand up until they get it right. We're talking about issue that affects Africa and here. Let's talk about the Blacks in UK. I've been a criminal defense advocate for almost 30 years. And most of my clients, or majority, in London in particular, are of ethnic minority group. And what do I find in common? I will address you if you just give me time. What do I find in common with many majority of them, my Black defendants, is that they've been let down by their parents. Majority of Black parents in London in particular are too busy chasing money. Many, I'm a Black man, I'm a Nigerian, British Nigerian, right? And I've sat down with many parents, and what they tell you is, oh, they're running around to raise the money. They don't have time to spend with their kids to talk to them. Now, don't let me digress too much. Going to the issue of South Africa. When I was at the uni some few years ago, about 30 years ago, I was involved in anti-apartheid movement in London. Sir Albert, if you know him, was part of, was the then chair for the Society of Black Lawyers in London. We're involved in a lot of demonstration in London here. I have many South African friends that we still communicate up to today. What is happening in South Africa, especially with the way other Africans in South Africa are being treated, is very sad. But as my friend, Mr. Chris said, they are victims of the past. But how do we address this? We address this by educating ourselves, our people, Black people, the youths, the parents here. Spend time to talk to your kids about the right and wrong of racism. What is worse than racism? Tribalism. That happens in Africa, in Nigeria, where I come from. If you're an Igbo man, you can get a job in the Yoruba land, or etc. So when we talk about racism, let's be real. We have a bigger problem among ourselves. Thank you.
Any comments?
Thank you. I think it kind of linked to what we've been saying in a way. I think if I get it right, you're talking about knowing our history, education. For example, not many people knows that Mandela is actually one of the innovators of Black Lives Matters. We hear about it recently because of what happened in America. I mean, Mandela actually started that by his speech at the Rivona trial, where he said, and I quote, "The complaint of Africans, however, is not only that they are poor and the whites are rich, but that the laws which are made by the whites are designed to preserve this situation. There are two ways to break out of poverty. The first is by formal education, and the second is by the worker acquiring a greater skill at his work, and thus higher wages. As far as Africans are concerned, both avenues of advancement are deliberately curtailed by legislation." So, what's he saying there? If we've been made to understand history or get educated, we will know that he's fighting for the lives of Black people in South Africa. So it's about knowing our history and getting educated.
Thank you. Okay, I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time and then ask the panel to comment or answer. William?
Thank you. I'm William Acker. I lecture at Birkbeck College, actually. So unfortunately, I wasn't there in 2018. Otherwise, I could have had some solidarity with you. I think.
William is from Birkbeck next door, so can.
Sorry, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, that's a bit better. That's just my question is that the title of the book is yeah. The title of the book is Black, Britain and Nelson Mandela. No, part of the discussion tonight about divisions, but actually there is the other side, where solidarities of the Black people involved in those solidarities us continents that have brought people together as part of in that struggle. But my activism is in the sense, what can we learn then that might help us now? I've spoken to them, spoken about things, part of the issues related to that actually tries to defeat that kind of racialized capital. Where this is very difficult to do. Immigration and when it becomes asylum. Some people in Western Canada, immigration is yeah. Other lessons that you can learn in terms of towards you post colonial. Others and attachments.
Thank you for that. Any others?
You confront its colonial past honestly. What role does diaspora media play in keeping the memory of anti-apartheid and independence struggles alive? What role can the diaspora play in preserving and retelling these stories? And the last question from this person is, what might reparative justice look like in terms of media representation and access? Another one, this is another one.
Did you get that? You read that, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. One more. On my right, okay, great. You're on your feet, so let's do it.
I want to understand what is the inclusivity of the current education program?
Sir, I'm not hearing you too well. Could you put this mic nearer to you?
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to understand what is I've got a bit of a cold, inclusivity regarding the education program that you were talking about, Nadia. I will just give you a little bit of history of me. I'm quite privileged to be in this room this moment. I'm a South African. My brother's a South African. I studied at Wits, and I came and grew up a stone throw away from Soweto. I was born, obviously, not in 1975, but I grew up in a mixed-race, segregated community. So what you guys are talking about, I can totally relate to because I'm from there. And I grew up in a school where I was in high school. We were not taught about the history of our country. There was nothing, apartheid wasn't in our vocab at all. I would play with children who looks like me, who talks like me, we'd eat the same foods. We were very multiracial, though. I would say multi-faith, because we'd go into each other's houses when it's Christmas, when it's Eid, eat everybody's food and play around. But we never knew that we were actually very different from others. And we didn't even know about the word apartheid. 1994 happened. And that was good for me because I was in high school back then. And I said, I want to study further. I never knew what study further meant. And my grandmother told me, we don't have money, get married and go and work in a bank. So that was what I was told. Today, I don't work in a bank. I'm not married, but I'm in the UK and I've got an accounting degree. But that's because I went to Wits. And I can say thank you to Nelson Mandela, because if that didn't happen, I would not have gone to Wits. I would have been at another university that didn't have any international accreditation, and I wouldn't have this opening. So hearing about the young children in the Gambia who have to find different ways, there are children in South Africa as well that don't have that. I consider myself privileged, but yet I'm from a place nobody will know. If you do know, it's on the map for the wrong reasons. El Dorado Park. Our young people have no opportunity. So I'm interested in that education program and how that can get a segue into elders, because our children know about drugs, they know about gambling, they know about doing all the wrong things. They know how to carry a knife. We in South Africa, we can carry a gun. It's not like here in the UK. So how does that help us? Because I feel that the colored children we call them coloured. I know it's derogatory here, but then back home, it's allowed. What are we doing for them? Because I feel they are left behind.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll come to you later in the last round of questions. Who would take William's question? William, the very first question. Nadia.
Yeah, I think actually they kind of link really. I think it's a very important point that you make about actually looking at some of the positives. So as I was saying in the work that I do for Anti-Apartheid Legacy, we go into schools throughout London and elsewhere, primary and secondary, as well as working with universities. And it's incredible actually, the higher up, and this is only obviously from our experience, but we've done a lot of engagement with schools and universities, that the higher up the educational tiers, the less people understand and know about South Africa. And it's the primary school children who not just know about Nelson Mandela, but they'll know who Rosa Parks is and all those things that we know get kind of churned out during Black History Month, but they do make those connections. And one of the positive things about the anti-apartheid struggle, I think, is when we think about how small the white population was, but how powerful and propped up by so many governments it was, that what was really positive was that, and this is something that we use a lot, or I definitely talk about a lot with schools, when we talk about the sense of oppression here as well, and lack of rights and the discrimination young Black people feel in terms of the police, etc. That the only really way forward is to kind of make those connections. And in South Africa, if we look at something like the treason trial, which seems, I mean, it is a very long time ago, 1956. But if you actually look at those 156 defendants in that trial, the majority are Black South Africans, but there are a sizable number of Indians, of what was known as coloureds, as you say, and white comrades. Some of them with what I think is incredible is there are obviously some that are intellectuals and had privileged backgrounds and went to university and, you know, came back from families who had money. But there were also people who were very much from the working class background. There were trade union activists, there were Muslims, there were Jews, there were Christians, there were people of no faith, there were communists. In that, to me, is a great example of what I was saying earlier, when you're really up against it, and I'm talking about the majority, Black people, you know, any support is a good thing. And it's actually incredible to know that there were white people who were prepared to get involved. I mean, there were many that didn't get involved. And now, you know, you're hard pushed to find a white South African who was pro-apartheid. You know, they apparently were all anti-apartheid, but we know that's not the case. But I also think it's worth remembering those people that did stand up. And so people like Bram Fischer, whose forefathers were people who founded apartheid, you know, he died as a result of his support for his comrades, and he was, you know, for defending the Rivonia trialists, and went to jail and died as a result. And Ruth First was assassinated. We know that she was very threatened. That the apartheid regime was very threatened by her because she was white and bright, and they didn't quite know what to do with her. So I think it's really important to make those connections. But I think more than that, it's back to teaching young people that, you know, those sorts of prejudices, that we know where they come from. We were able to talk about the class issues. We were able to talk about the fact that, you know, if you're a Black person and you're starving, hungry in South Africa now, you will, like people here, be encouraged to think it's the result of the people that are coming from other countries, rather than looking at the cause of that oppression. And the more that we do to kind of generate those conversations so that people are fully aware of what the cause is, the better. And I think there is I can see it sometimes when we're working with young people, the kind of moment where they actually start making those connections and linking those things. I think it's a lot of work that needs to be done. And as you were, the woman that's come from South Africa, a coloured woman, one of the people that we work with is a South African exile who gives a fantastic lived experience. That's one thing that we use a lot when we're working with schools. And she was classified as coloured in South Africa, and talks about her journey, how she got involved with the white man and how that was obviously impossible under the Immorality Act and the mixed marriages, but also her journey of trying to understand that oppression and the kind of degrees of it and how people succumb to it, and how leaving there made her more conscious of what actually the system does to you. And it does that over decades and decades and decades. We still have, the legacy of enslavement, and how our minds have been enslaved, and how that encourages those sorts of divisions. So it's a huge journey, I think, but I think it has to start with working with young people and engaging them in those kind of conversations, and letting them see the kind of the differences, the class differences, but also the potential for making those connections and recognizing those links. Because it's very, very easy when people are hungry to see somebody else as the enemy, and not actually see, what the frontline states were really supportive of the fight against apartheid. Look how many people, dedicated themselves to that. And we think about the kind of people that were involved from Cuba, for example, and gave their lives for the struggle for freedom. So I think those histories have to be taught. That's the only way we can kind of really address that. And in our work, we use a lot of testimonies, oral histories. We're trying to capture as many as we can from the elders that are still alive, but also their children and their children's children, to see where perhaps those disconnections are in terms of using that same history, but not necessarily engaging with it in a lived experience way. And I think that's part of what we're really trying to do to change that.
Well, yes, we all know that the media is very powerful. And regrettably, the media at times, it's not a good promoter of an identity, of a national identity, in the sense that who is the editor, who is the control, and what agenda are they trying to bring out? And regrettably, some of the diaspora media has been identified, maybe it can be with ethnicity, or it is also being accused of personalizing the history of what's happening back home in Africa, which is not right. So I think the media, they have to be inclusive, not to have a genuine recognition that when it comes to Africa, it is a colonial construct as we know it. And since Africa is a colonial construct as we know it, as a media, what role should we play? Is it a play of appeasing one group over the other because the owner or the editor of that particular newspaper is of a certain ethnic group? What is it? What do you want? That's the issue. So I think the media can play a role if they are genuine. But at times the media at times has been manipulated by the political forces back home to sell an agenda to make others stay in power for long. And media has been used by the opposition back home to fight each other, to fight those who are ruling. And as a result, that is splitting us. You see a media from Zimbabwe, from South Africa, one is very much EFF, Malema, the other one is ANC. So how can we be united? How can we bring this history out when the media is taking a narrative of who is in power or who is in control, and that is not helping?
Okay, I think we got time for one last question. Sorry, there was someone on the right. Yes, please.
Contributing to this book, and to Elizabeth Williams for writing the book or editing the book. Just going to paraphrase a quote by Amilcar Cabral, who was mentioned. Always bear in mind that people are not fighting for ideas, they are fighting for their lives to be better. I'll leave it there. This year is 140 years since the Berlin Conference, which divvied up Africa. This month, it's 65 years since the Sharpeville massacre. The struggle continues for our people. Struggle continues for an awful lot of people across the world. So I have one question, because though this book is a wonderful contribution, what I would like to know is, how do we, and that's all of us in this room, make knowledge like this accessible to ordinary people beyond academia? And actually, I'm just going to add a second one, because the book focuses on Nelson Mandela, who made such a wonderful contribution. But my second question is, how do we ensure that his stories and her stories of the many, many, many people who contributed towards the struggle against apartheid in Africa, and the many people beyond who are contributing towards the struggle for a fairer and more just world, is also listened to and heard? And the reason why I say that is because my personal belief is the over focus on individuals actually makes everyone think that they can't do it, they can't make a contribution.
Thank you very much. Sireita, do you want to address this?
No, I think that's a poignant statement and series of questions, and I'll hone in on the element of how do we make this accessible. I think we all have a role to play in terms of educating young people. That's I think that came up on the panel quite a bit in terms of we've got Nadia already doing the best that she can in terms of the oral histories. And one of the things that I try to ensure that I do is, when engaging with people, young people, irrespective of whichever country I'm in, you know, it's bringing up some of that significant history and sharing that. Yes, we do have to think about things like publication and the cost of the books, and making sure that I see where the question was coming from, and making sure that you know that work does not just sit in one place. How do we do that? I think that's a conversation to be continued, but one that must happen.
I'm just add a closing comment, really. And in relation to this question, it seems to me that we need to adopt a completely different approach to knowledge production and knowledge validation. In academic circles, we talk about epistemology, and particularly the hegemony of Western epistemology, the way in which what we are taught is produced and reproduced and validated and assessed in schools and universities and so on. It seems to me that what Sireita has been describing in terms of her work, and what Nadia was talking about in terms of the consciousness of young people in Soweto, speaks to the issue of people producing knowledge through their activities, whether it be in resistance to oppression or generally in giving expression to themselves and to their culture, and that being seen as valid and foundations upon which they can build theories and can build paradigms for their own liberation. I mean, I don't think, I could stress that too strongly. One of my gurus is Paulo Freire, and he speaks to that issue very eloquently, particularly when he talks about education having the function to humanize society. And I think to a very large extent, much of what we've been talking about and much of what the book addresses has got to do with how people understand their world and all its contradictions and challenges and oppressions, and organize themselves where they are, irrespective of class or caste or ethnicity or whatever, so that they work collectively to bring about change, and indeed in their own common interests. I want to thank you for coming, for your participation, for your questions, and encourage you to buy the book. I think you'd be told a bit more about how you do that. It's a pity that whatever house rules this publisher has, there aren't books here for you to hold and feel and stuff. But I'm sure that you can find ways of accessing and acquiring your own copy. Would you like to come and who is going to? Yes.
That makes it prohibitive to a lot of people. However, it is available open access through universities, and I would encourage those. I know there's some teachers here as well, to even just invest in a book from your school library and to order it from New Beacon Books and support New Beacon Books rather than Amazon or anywhere else. If there's a bulk order, I'm doing an advert now for New Beacon, we will give an educational discount, but please support New Beacon Books. And it's not a book that we're going to regularly be stocking because of its price, but yes, make use of the open access for your students as well.
I'm Hannah, I'm the Events and Outreach Manager at the SOAS Library, and thank you all for joining us today for this wonderful event. And I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to all our moderator and all the speakers for their insightful and wonderful contribution. And also like to acknowledge Elizabeth Williams, the editor of the book, who couldn't be with us today, unfortunately, but let's give them all a round of applause now. So this was the first collaborative event between Senate House Library and SOAS Library, and I hope to continue this partnership in the future. And I'd like to mention that, as Claire said, that the Senate House Library's exhibition in the Grip of Change, the Caribbean and its British diaspora has been extended until 12th April. So please check out the Senate House Library website for more. And also they have they will host wonderful events. So please check out the website for more information. And at SOAS Library, we have an exciting event on next Tuesday, Defying Limits, Women's Voices in Challenging Professions, to celebrate Women's History Month. So, and I think I left some leaflets at the back, so please feel free to take a leaflet on your way out to find out more. And remember, anyone can become a SOAS Library browsing member for free. I'm sure my colleague Amma wanted to mention that because she kept pushing me, keep the pressure to me. But Amma, I do not forget. Anyone can be a member for free to browse at the SOAS Library, and you can find information in that leaflet as well. So do not forget to take our leaflet, and we'd love to see you there in the library. And so again, thank you for coming, and we hope to see you in the future events. Again, let's give one more round of applause to our speaker, moderator, and Elvis Williams. So yeah, as you could see, there's a reception outside, so we have to talk a bit outside there. Thank you so much.